Welcome to HortTube. My name is Jim Putnam. This is the 4th episode of 2018, building this little backyard propagation greenhouse. I'm going to finish it up today and get started on cuttings as soon as tomorrow, probably. I have done a couple tasks since the last video. I did put gravel down in here, and it's pea gravel. It was the cheapest thing at the box store, so that's what I got. I'm short about 4 bags up at the top, of course. I figured it a little bit low. I think I got 12. I used one for another project, so there's 11 in there and I need 4 more. So let's say it's gonna take 15 bags, you know, to put 3/4 of an inch to an inch of gravel in the bottom of this house. I went through and I tightened all the bolts. That's something I had not done yet. So those 15, I think 15 bolts or whatever it is, got tightened up. This thing is very, very rigid now. And I have spiked it down to the ground. I actually used these 12-inch spikes right here. I pre-drilled a hole that's slightly smaller than the spike. And then I used a little tiny hammer because I realized I didn't have my sledgehammer here at the house, and so I didn't want to drive back to the garden center, so I used this little teeny tiny hammer. It was no big deal. This is a 2x4 frame on the bottom, so this 12-inch spike with a hole through that 2x4 hammered into the ground is totally adequate. This is a very low profile house, so most of the wind is just going to go right over the top of it. I built it like a Prius, I think, so the wind is just going to go right over the top of it. And I don't think it's going to be a problem. If you're building a bigger house, you need to anchor it down better than I just did. And you can use some of the scrap lumber you had left over and mill this down into something that you can drive down into the ground in the corners and then screw to the actual frame. Make sure it's pressure treated. Also, if you're bending the pipes and cutting them down like I did, the pieces of metal from the top rail that you're cutting off the bottom can actually be driven into the ground and then bolted into the side. So that's another way you could anchor this thing to the ground. But make sure in some way or another you anchor it to the ground. If you use anything bigger than a 2x4, this 12-inch spike is not going to work. Because with this, I put, I guess, 8.5 inches of it ends up in the ground because that board's actually 3.5 inches tall. So good, but not great. If you used a 2x6 or a 2x8, which you would on a bigger house, you definitely need something longer than this, and this wouldn't be adequate. Of course, it's a tall house. It's definitely not adequate because you're going to have much more of a wind load on it, and it needs to be anchored better. So there you go. Gravel's in, tightened up, bolted to the ground. All that's left now is to get the plastic on and put a shade cloth over that. I have this roll of batten tape. This is a special vinyl material that you actually put on the outside of the plastic and staple through the batten tape and then through the plastic and into the board. You cannot staple directly through the plastic into the board. You can, but it will not hold up. The plastic pulls away from that staple very, very easily. Plus it has a draft in between every single staple on here. This kind of holds the whole thing tight to the house. There's a lot of different ways you can do this. If you don't want to order any of this batten tape, you can definitely, I've just used duct tape before. I've used electrical tape. So you can just put a piece of electrical tape across your plastic and staple through that electrical tape, and it just prevents the constant, you know, bouncing that this plastic's going to do if there's any wind on it from tearing away from those staples. It is definitely a necessary thing to pinch the plastic between the board and some other material, some other flexible material, ideally. Then there are other ways to put plastic on greenhouses. There's wiggle wire, which you can look up. That's what I had on my big house at the nursery, which makes it very, very easy to put plastic on it, take plastic on and off. I just really couldn't justify going and buying, you know, a bunch of wiggle wire for this little teeny tiny greenhouse. It'll be easy, super easy to pull a piece of plastic over it, cut it to size, and staple it on using my, I've got an electric stapler here. These will just be basic T50 staples that fit most staple guns, and I'm using 1/2-inch staples. Quick and easy, honestly. I'm gonna roll the piece of plastic out here, cut it to the length that I need it, and then pull it over and start stapling in place. Very, very important. This is June when I'm doing this. If you plan on leaving the plastic on your house long term, plastic shrinks in the wintertime. So it's, you know, 80 some degrees out here this morning. This plastic is, if I put this plastic on super, super tight, when it cools off in the fall or gets cold in the winter, it will bust my plastic. It will actually split the plastic along one of the seams because it will shrink up and it'll get super, super, super tight until quite possibly it just burst open. So if you're putting plastic on in the summertime, leave it a little loose. If you're putting plastic on in the wintertime, you can tighten it up a little more. So the hard part of putting the plastic on is done. Like I say, I've left it loose. It's not crazy loose, but you definitely has a little bit of bounce in the top right there because it will tighten up when it gets colder. I went around and cut down to maybe 3/4 of an inch to an inch under the batting tape right there just to clean it all up. And I went all the way around and did that. Now I just have to hang a piece of plastic on both end walls. Much easier to do on a vertical space than this weird curved space. And I'm going to end up cutting out this block right here. This will just be ventilation is how I'm going to leave it, because it's going to get super, super hot in there. We'll just let the hot air blow out of there. The way this works is through evaporative cooling. It's super hot in this greenhouse from about halfway up, to the top. But this water, this mist that comes out on these plants, as water evaporates, it cools the air around it. So in my building these type of propagation houses, what you're doing is you're keeping the cuttings down here 60 degrees or 65 degrees, and the air up here is super hot. People used to go in my propagation greenhouse at the nursery and go, how in the world could you ever root cuttings in here? Because up in the 5.5, 6 feet up where you're standing, where your face is, super, super hot. But actually right down at the ground where that water is constantly evaporating, it's very, very cool. System works very, very well that way. Okay, I'm gonna hang the end walls. Then I gotta cut out a little space for a door. I'm just gonna let the plastic hang down right here, and that's how I'll go in and out of the space. But that's it, and then I'll drag the shade cloth over the top of it. Shade cloth's the easiest part of all. Be super, super careful when you're cutting the end wall plastic, and to not cut this over here, to cut the old plastic. I'm speaking from experience. I have put a couple holes in plastic after I put it on before, but I just kind of hold it away from that other, so there's no chance that I can cut the first piece of plastic I put on. I put the batting tape on all surfaces. I'm gonna make my door like this. I'm just gonna come to the inside of that piece, go down like this, go pretty low down to that bottom piece, just like that. Same thing on this side. Leave the top piece intact. There we go. That's how we'll go in and out. I'm going to staple a thin piece of board to the bottom of this just to add a little bit of weight to it so it sits down there even. And that's my super, super simple door right there. This piece right here, I'm just going to come in here and cut out. For now, I'm going to cut out a piece about that big, about half of it. If I find that it's still too hot in here, I'll be able to reach my hand in here, and if it's super, super hot, I'll go ahead and open this up a little more. But there you go, there's the door, there's that. I'll walk you around here real quick with the camera. Okay, so here's the door, all our irrigation and gravel, everything looking good in there. This is best it'll ever look, because they don't get better in time like this, so, but it looks great right now. And there's our little ventilation hole. Again, I put the plastic on. It's got a little bit of bounce in it. Anytime it's hot outside, I know to leave a little bounce in the plastic. And the back side is done exactly the same way. There's batting tape. Any place there's a 2x4, there's batting tape, and it's stapled down with those T50 staples. I've got an electric stapler, but any stapler would work. It doesn't really matter. If you may want to get a hand with the plastic, especially the first time you do it. I've done enough of these that I'm not scared to tackle it by myself. If it's a bigger house than this, it has to be 2 people. It's not even an option, really. This shade cloth that I link in the bottom of this every time from Amazon comes with grommets that you make yourself. It's just a little plastic piece that bends over. You can put them anywhere you want to put them. So I can just put it right into there, lock it in, and I poke a hole through there, and then I can put a string down here to the ground or staple a string or something to the side just to keep this on kind of tight. I'm not going to staple it down to the frame because I want to be able to remove it potentially, especially in the winter time. I'd like to get a little more sun in here and actually keep the heat up in the house. Right now I'm trying to keep the heat down a little bit. I mean, I'm saying I propagate and it's hot, but if I left this just plastic, it would be unbearably hot in there. It'd be too hot. So I put this, this is a 50% shade cloth, and it'll allow it to heat up big time in there. The unrooted cuttings don't really need a lot of direct sunlight. You'll see when I start putting a few under my deck over here, which can go in any kind of shady space. It doesn't have to be a deck, but I'm gonna put some under there in a more simpler way. They just don't need a lot of light. But if you deny them light, you can't just bring them directly back out in the sun, and I'll show you that at some point. You have to actually transition them back into kind of part sun and then full sun later. So there you go. This thing's ready to go. Irrigation's ready. House is ready. Everything's in place. I'm going to get started immediately on some lantana cuttings like I talked about in the last video. And then from there, we'll propagate all kinds of things, blueberries, figs, and all kinds of ornamental trees and shrubs and perennials during the rest of the summer. So thank you very much for watching this video, and don't forget to subscribe to catch the next videos.